Welcome, flute players. Welcome to 3 tips for playing low D on Irish flute. My name's Leslie, and I've been playing flute since I was a little kid, so for quite a while. And I play Irish flute on both the wooden simple system flute, which is this flute that you see behind me, and the silver flute, which you see in band classes and orchestras and stuff like that. So if you play either of those, you're in the right place. We're going to talk about tips that work for both of them. And we're going to talk about how to get a really great low D when you're playing Irish traditional music. Low D was the note that made me really want to learn how to play Irish flute. It's when it's done well, it's really dark, it's really edgy, it's filled with overtones, and it's also the tonic and the dominant of the 2 keys that we play in most often. So a lot of Irish traditional flute playing happens in the key of D major, and it happens in the key of G major. In D major, it's the tonic of the scale, and that means that it's the most important note. It's the note that our ears want a tune to resolve to. It's the note that tells us that a tune has finished happily and everything is okay in the world. And in the key of G, D is the dominant, and what that means is it's the 5th note of the scale. And the dominant is the note that drives our ears towards wanting the tonic. It creates anticipation. So they're both important in their own way in those 2 scales, or the same note is important in those 2 scenarios. And it's also the lowest note on unkeyed simple system flutes, and a lot of keyed simple system flutes that don't have low C sharps or low C keys in addition to all of their other keys. So those are some of the reasons why it's so important. But the most important reason is it's just absolutely gorgeous and it is so much fun. But it's also a little bit tricky. And so there are 3 tips that I think are really helpful when you're trying to navigate low Ds, especially if you're new to Irish traditional flute playing. And we'll go over those today. So 3 tips. And I also wrote an article on this subject, and I'll pop a link in the description below if you are a visual person and you want to read rather than watch. But the 3 tips are: 1, make sure that you are focusing with your upper lip. So the center of your upper lip, you want to focus with that. 2, you want to make sure you're directing the airstream with your lower jaw. And 3, you want to propel the airstream with your abdomen. Okay, so 1, focusing upper lip, 2, directing with lower jaw, 3, propelling with your abdomen. Those are 3 really important things. And whenever I'm asked about low Ds, which is one of the most common questions I get asked as a flute teacher, if there's not a leak in the fingers trying to cover holes, it's usually one of these 3 tips, or all of them, that can be worked on to kind of create a stronger, gutsier, more beautiful low D. So we'll work on those together now. So if you have your flute, grab whatever you're most comfortable playing. I'll start with this one. And let's just make sure we have the same fingerings. So for low D on this flute, you're going to cover all 3 holes down here and all 3 holes up here, and that's your low D. So, okay. So you just want to make sure you don't have any cracks. If you have any cracks, it'll be harder. I know that's tricky. Okay. And then if you're playing one of these, it's pretty similar. You just want to make sure you cover 3 keys here and 3 keys here, and add your thumb back here. And I recommend not using your thumb B flat, just because we don't use B flat very often in Irish traditional flute playing. So save yourself some trouble and don't put your thumb there. So low D. That's your low D there. So if you're just out of orchestra or band rehearsal, you might have noticed that low D might sound a little different than what you're used to, and that's because we're trying to get those big, rich, beautiful overtones into that low D, and we're creating maybe an edgier or sharper sound than maybe you'll usually play with. And that is A-okay. So, tip 1. Let's talk about engaging that upper lip. So, we want to create a small opening in our mouth, because if we do that, then the airstream will rush through that small opening with a lot more focus and direction and speed. One way to do that is to engage the little muscles here in the center of your upper lip and to kind of push them down onto the airstream. And if that feels really abstract and you're thinking, I don't know where those muscles are, think about elongating your nose downwards, like you're looking down your nose at somebody with a little bit of scorn, and elongate that nose downwards. It engages, interestingly enough, these muscles here. So experiment with that. Try a low D and see if you can engage those muscles down. You're pressing your upper lip downwards onto your airstream. And if that feels not quite accessible yet, try it on an easier note, maybe like a B. B is just that top finger. If you're playing this, it's the top finger with that thumb key added. And try it on a B. And you're engaging that upper lip down. When some people are playing, they use the corners of their mouth a little bit more to direct and focus the sound. Everybody's mouth is different, so I wouldn't tell people what to do, especially if we're not having a dialogue. But what I have noticed with myself is if I rely on my corners to create my embouchure, my sound is a lot airier. And the reason for that is if you frown or if you smile when you're playing, you get a lot airier sound because you're pulling the hole in the center of your mouth wide. So here it is with a frown. Here it is with a smile. And you hear how airy it is. And here it is with that upper lip engaged, and the corners just they're just sort of neutral. They're not super actively engaged. So you hear that difference. So that's why I always suggest, like, think about these muscles. And as you're working on it, I would also say in your pre-flute life, there's not a lot of time when you would use these tiny little muscles in your upper lip. There's not many instances when that would be necessary that I can think of. So as you're practicing, they're going to get tired, and they'll get tired pretty quickly if you've never done that before. So give yourself lots of breaks. That is the best use of your time. If you try to keep playing and these are tired, you'll start engaging your corners instead, and then you'll just start using the muscles maybe you don't want to be focusing on. So the best use of your time is to just go and make a cup of tea, take a 5-minute break, and then come back. And then just acknowledge that it'll be a long, gradual process. Like, you're not going to run a marathon today if you've never run before. And it's the same thing with your upper lip. You're not going to get a really awesome low D with just the strength of that upper lip if it's not something you've engaged before. So work on it slowly, gradually, at your own pace, and you will get there. There are some things we can do, though, to help that upper lip. And so the second tip that we'll talk about is directing the airstream with our lower jaw. And I think this is super important and not always discussed with flute players because we're so, wrapped up in breathing and fingers and mouth that we often forget that our lower jaw has an incredible range of motion that can be really, really helpful. So what I find to be helpful with low Ds is directing the airstream downwards, down as much as I can into the floor, into the flute, down towards my lap. I want the airstream down. A good way to do that is to open the lower jaw, drop it open, and kind of pull it back towards your body. So if you know that really incredibly awkward face you make when you're trying to swallow a yawn, or kind of pulling your lower jaw down and back, it's that exact face. And I'm really sorry if I just made everybody yawn, but that's what you want to do. So here is a low D with my jaw as closed as I can make it and still play the flute. So here it is. So you notice it's kind of a quiet, mellow sound, which is fine. But then here it is with the jaw opened and pulled back. So you notice it's a little bit stronger. And if I turn to the side, I'm just going to show you the range of motion that's available. So I'll start pretty closed and then I'll open. So you'll notice there's quite a range of motion there. So that's something you can experiment with as well. And again, you can start on a note that feels a little more accessible. So maybe a B again. That's a good go-to. And just experiment with that. See if you can drop your jaw open and pull it back a little bit. And if it helps, I'm putting my hand here because sometimes that can feel, again, rather abstract. If you put your hand here, you can feel that motion with your thumb, and you can even feel it in the muscle here near your ear. It's a good exercise. And then once that feels, a little bit more attainable, then move it down to a lower note, maybe an A. And then down to a G. And then eventually down to a D. And see if you can get that really big low D. So that's tip 2. Tip 3, you want to propel your air with your abdomen. So we want a lot of force behind our low D. So the idea is if we have a really focused embouchure, if we have a really directed airstream, we want to make sure that airstream is propelled through that direction, through that focus. And so we do that with our abdomen. And a really good way to make sure that we're doing that well is to make sure we're breathing in well. Not just breathing out well, but breathing in well. Because if you breathe in well, everything else will work. So if you've ever used the bellows to, help a fire in its infancy, you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you think about popping a bellows open like that, that's exactly what we want. And when you're practicing breathing in, you want to make sure that you don't clench with your throat. And one of the ways we can tell that our throat is a little tense, we all have tension these days, it's really easy to do, myself included, is if when we breathe in, there's a high-pitched sound. So that's a slightly tense breath. Hear that high pitch. If we want a more relaxed breath, which will be more efficient, breathe in on a syllable like an O. That's what we're looking for. So we want a really, as silent as possible, low-pitched, kind of open sort of breath in. And if you do that, I'm having to expel air to keep talking, you'll breathe in very efficiently. So we're going to try that. Let's do it on a B again. And you're going to breathe in on that O syllable. And then you're going to practice playing a series of notes with a ha syllable. So you're going to breathe in and then go ha, ha, ha. So you're engaging your abdomen. Let's do it on a B. You should feel that abdomen pushing that air out. Fast forward to a D, it's harder. We'll slow it down. So take in a big O. Okay, and when you're doing this, make sure you're focusing with that upper lip. Make sure you're directing with that lower jaw. And then you're propelling with that abdomen. And you should get some really big, beautiful low Ds. And if that feels comfortable, I would definitely recommend checking out Out on the Ocean. I'll put a link to it in the description. Out on the Ocean is a great, great classic session tune. It has some really nice low Ds in it. It starts on a low D. It's fabulous. So you hear all those low Ds and hopefully how rich and edgy they are. And that's a good tune to practice. So check out that description, that link in the description. And I think those are the 3 tips. So just remember, focus your upper lip, direct with your jaw, propel with your abdomen, and you should have a low D in 4 to 6 weeks. No, whenever it works, you'll have it. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave me a comment below, and check out those links in the description. And I wish all of you happy fluting.